Hello everyone, I am the Meta Kirby, and welcome to my channel, The Commander Tavern. The Commander Tavern is a channel dedicated to my favorite Magic the Gathering format. The Brewery is a series on this channel showcasing my spicy brews under the deck text. On this episode of The Brewery, I'll be discussing my take on a new commander partnering made possible thanks to Kamigawa, Neon Dynasty, Yoshimaru Ever Faithful, and Vial Smasher the Fierce. If you like this deck or any of the cards I'll be mentioning throughout the video, please consider using my TCG Player affiliate link when purchasing those cards. You can find that link down in the description. It'll really help out the channel. The best way you can help support the channel is with my Patreon. For just $1, patrons get early access to certain videos on YouTube. In fact, patrons got a chance to see this video earlier. You can also support my channel for free by simply liking, subscribing, and sharing, which also helps out a lot. You can join my Discord server for free if you want to join the Commander Tavern community. All pertinent links are down in the description. Alright, let's get back to the episode. Yoshimaru is a 1/1 dog with partner for just 1 white mana. He also has a triggered ability that gives him a +1/+1 counter whenever a legendary permanent enters the battlefield under your control. Clearly this screams out legendary tribal with Voltron. As of the recording of this video, there are 56 possible partners for Yoshimaru in the command zone. Of those, I chose Vial Smasher the Fierce. While there are plenty of other amazing partners for Yoshimaru like Tavern, Jessica, Arden, Raihan, Sakashima, Rograk, Kelith, Kedis, Anara, etc., I decided to go with Vial Smasher because giving Yoshimaru access to black and red allowed me to add plenty of amazing legendary permanents that can help out with the Voltron aspect of the deck. Plus, from what I've gathered, hardly anyone else has built Yoshimaru with Vial Smasher anyways, so there's also that hipster aspect to it too. It's a shame that Cecily has Friends Forever and not straight up partner, since giving Yoshimaru access to 3 additional colors would have been even more amazing. That or giving Yoshimaru partner and Friends Forever since he's the goodest boy. At least Vial Smasher is a good enough friend for Yoshimaru. Vial Smasher being a 2/3 Goblin Berserker with partner for 1 generic, 1 black, and 1 red. She has a triggered ability whenever you cast your first spell each turn, dealing damage equal to its mana cost to an opponent chosen at random. While this might not seem synergistic with Yoshimaru, it kind of works. You're going aggro with Yoshimaru, so you're bound to kill someone off with commander damage. But you still have other creatures you can be attacking with. Vial Smasher provides another way to deal damage in case you're limited to how you can attack. In any case, they're both tiny and rambunctious, bound to get into a lot of trouble together, which is precisely what this deck aims to do. Hello everyone, the Meta Kirby from the future here. While editing the video, I got inspired to also build Yoshimaru with Kraum as his partner. After testing the minor tweaks to this deck to make up for swapping out black for blue, I ended up with something equally satisfying. So this episode is actually a 2-for-1. At the end of the Vial Smasher deck tech, you'll find a guide on how to change this deck from Yoshimaru with Vial Smasher to Yoshimaru with Kraum. So if that's something you'd also like to consider, watch until the very end. It would seem this season is going out with a bang, or a bark. Alright, now back to the version with Vial Smasher. Thanks to Yoshimaru caring about legendary permanents entering the battlefield, we can build a Voltron deck centered around him where we can use legendary permanents whenever convenient. For example, we can use cheap legendary equipment to make Yoshimaru get a +1/+1 counter, as well as being generally more deadly. Thus, the deck is running Eater of Virtue, Shadow Spear, Ember Cleave, Sword of the Animist, Black Blade Reforged, Hammer of the Zan, Umezawa's Jite, and Mask of Gristlebrand. While all of these provide some keyword or another, they were included for their casting cost, equip cost, and effect. Of note, Sword of the Animist can help us ramp by fetching a basic land whenever the equipped creature attacks. Hammer of the Zan auto-equips, making Yoshimaru indestructible, but it also makes other equipment auto-equip with his clutch. Umezawa's Jite is a total all-star here, especially when Yoshimaru has double strike. You can use the Jite to gain life in a pinch or further pump Yoshimaru in a future attack to take out a hapless opponent. Or you can also use it to give a creature -1/-1 as many times as you can to kill it. Mask of Gristlebrand is a great deterrent against anyone planning to kill Yoshimaru since we'll draw a ton of cards when it dies. We do lose the same amount of life, but the mask gives him lifelink, so hopefully we have a high enough life total to buffer it. Non-legendary equipment like Swiftfoot Boots and Champion's Helm are also included. We don't really need so many ways to protect Yoshimaru, since it only costs 1 to cast, so we can definitely recast him multiple times in a game. Plus, the deck does have synergistic ways of protecting Yoshimaru. With so many notable pieces of equipment, Arden Intrepid Archaeologist is also included in the deck. While you can go full-blown mono-white equipment matters with Arden as Yoshimaru's partner, I decided to have Arden in the 99 so that I could add more colors to Yoshimaru. Hopefully with WotC printing better cards for white in Commander, this might be even more viable in the future. Sword of the Chosen and Jessica Thrice Reborn are some more legendary ways to pump Yoshimaru. I love Sword of the Chosen because it's a precursor to what would eventually become equipment. For just 2 mana, it can enter the turn after Yoshimaru, giving it a +1/+1 counter and then being tapped to give it +2/+2 more until end of turn. So good. Jessica is even more busted since you can give her 0 loyalty ability to make Yoshimaru deal thrice combat damage instead. So all it needs to do is get through with 7 damage to kill off an opponent. That should be easy enough thanks to Rogue's Passage. While it taps down for colorless and most of the lands in the deck tap for a single color of mana, it's still worth including since it's an all-star in Voltron decks. Same with Witch's Clinic. The amount of life we can gain off of Yoshimaru is crazy. Same with Vial Smasher if we wanted to, since she deals non-combat damage to a random opponent, which is still damage that can gain us life if she had a lifelink. Iroha's God of Victory and Runetail Kitsune Ascendant help Yoshimaru not receive damage when it's attacking, which is great for going all out. Well, at least Runetail does it when it flips into Runetail's Essence, which it can do the moment it enters the battlefield because we already start with 40 life. As a bonus, Iroha's also gives all of our creatures Menace, which is even more evasion for Yoshimaru. It's also an indestructible 7/4 with Menace when Devotion is met, which is nothing to scoff at. 8.5 Tails is another legend that can grant protection to Yoshimaru. Quite literally, since you can use it to give him protection from white. While white is statistically the color least played in the format, 8.5 Tails can turn any spell or permanent white in order to really guarantee the protection. It's also useful to make Yoshimaru unblockable if we have enough mana to make all potential blockers white, and then give Yoshimaru protection from white. So there's that to keep in mind as well. Bastion Protector is another way to protect not only Yoshimaru, but Vial Smasher too, since it gives our commanders indestructible. Oh, and +2/+2 as a bonus. It might not be legendary, but this creature is too good to pass up, especially in partner commander decks. Obosh the Prey Piercer, Ketis Emberclaw Familiar, and Falthus Shadowcat Familiar are some more ways of making Yoshimaru dangerous. Obosh also makes Vial Smasher dangerous since she has an odd casting cost. In fact, if you wanted to, you could build this deck with Obosh as a companion, but you'd have to really tweak it. This deck list at least. I considered it, but a lot of the even costed spells in here are too good to pass up, so Obosh ended up in the 99 because having Vial Smasher and Yoshimaru in particular deal double damage is no joke. Ketis makes Yoshimaru not so much a Voltron commander since it distributes the love. If you have a pesky control player in the pod, they'll still receive damage. It won't be combat damage, but they're still getting smacked. Falthus makes Yoshimaru a pain to block and basically guarantees that Yoshimaru takes out both blockers. So good. Day of Destiny and Heroes Podium are some more legendary effects that pump our commanders. And not just our commanders, but all of our legendary creatures as well. Heroes Podium is also not just a one-sided coat of arms effect for our legendary creatures, because we can also filter the top X cards of our library for a legendary creature. Bruce Tarl, Bruce Herder, and Keleth Sunmane Familiar also serve to beef up Yoshimaru, but via an attack trigger. Whenever Bruce attacks, it can give Yoshimaru double strike and a lifelink, which is absolutely absurd. Keleth gives Yoshimaru a +1/+1 whenever it attacks, pumping it even further. Both of these are also potential partners for Yoshimaru if you wanted to go with either of them instead. Norin the Weary, Karizev Skyship Raider, Ragavan Nimble Pilferer, and Zurgo Bellstriker are amazing legends for a Yoshimaru deck with access to red. Norin is so good because he's basically always leaving the battlefield and returning, giving Yoshimaru a +1/+1 counter each time he does, which is repeated +1/+1 counters. In fact, that's what all these have in common. Every time Karizev attacks, she creates a legendary token. That token entering the battlefield triggers Yoshimaru. Same with Ragavan and Zurgo. Since they have dash, what we want to do is actually cast them for their dash cost instead. So for just 2 mana, we're giving Yoshimaru a +1/+1 counter each time we do. Granted, Ragavan is currently a very expensive card due to it being an all-star in Modern, Legacy, and Vintage, and while amazing here, it's not 100% needed. You can swap it out for something else instead. Sigarda Summons, Krathar's Crusade, and Together Forever are some amazing enchantments for the deck, even if they're non-legendary. Sigarda Summons is absolutely insane since it makes Yoshimaru a 4/4 flyer as its base, meaning that it's almost like it's giving it +3/+3 and flying. Oh, and it also makes Yoshimaru an angel, which is no surprise because he's the goodest boy. Krathar's Crusade pairs amazingly well with it too, since it gives a +1/+1 counter to all of our creatures whenever a creature we control enters the battlefield. Just imagine having Krathar's Crusade on the battlefield when you're attacking with Karizev, or when you're dashing in Zurgo every turn, or when you have Norin delay blinking himself time and time again. This helps you go wide instead of just relying on Yoshimaru too. And as I just said, it pairs great with Sigarda Summons because then all of our creatures having a +1/+1 counter on them will make them 4/4 flyers by default. Together Forever only puts a +1/+1 counter on up to 2 creatures when it enters the battlefield, but that's not why it's included. That's just a bonus. For just 1 generic mana, we can recover any creature that dies with a counter on it. so if Yoshimaru were to bite the dust for some reason, we could pay 1 generic and just have it return to our hand instead. Same with any creature of ours with a +1/+1 counter. Speaking of saving Yoshimaru, Halvar God of Battle does just that. Well, not this half at least. Halvar is still good because it gives our equipped creatures double strike, which is amazing for aggroing out with Yoshimaru. Plus, he can also move an equipment around to another creature at the beginning of each combat. However, while Halvar is still amazing to cast as it is in this deck, it's actually his backside, Sword of the Realms, that's the best spell, most of the time at least. This sword is super cheap to cast, super cheap to equip, and gives the equipped creature an effect similar to Together Forever, except that it's free and automatic. When the equipped creature dies, it's returned to our hand. This is amazing for Voltron decks. Oh, and if that weren't enough, it also gives +2/+0 and Vigilance. Who says white cards are bad? Cole the Forge Master and Kaya the Inexorable are some more legends that do the same thing. Cole is super cheap to cast and is already protecting an equipped Yoshimaru for free, since that ability requires no mana. He also has a boon for creature tokens, but that really isn't the focus of this deck. Kaya's first ability is the one that can protect Yoshimaru, not just from death, but from getting exiled too. Her other abilities are relevant as well, exiling a non-land permanent and getting an emblem that really makes sure Yoshimaru is impossible to deal with. Not only that, but most of the cards in this deck are legendary, so if we're able to get this emblem, we're set. Primeval's Glorious Rebirth is one such card that wouldn't be bad being able to cast for free from our graveyard each upkeep thanks to Kaya's emblem. That being said, a more conservative analysis of the card shows that it's just a no-brainer in this deck. We get to reanimate all of our legendary permanents, so if anyone were to wipe the board, we can recover almost everything, even from a Jokal Hops since the deck has a ton of legendary lands, which we'll soon see. Notwithstanding, the deck's also running classic protective cards like Teferi's Protection, Boros Charm, and Deflecting Swap. While a board wipe will set us back too hard, we don't want to have to go through that trouble anyways. Deflecting Swat is also great because Yoshimaru has the potential to eat up removal, so redirecting that removal for free is always great. But even better than that is stealing extra turn spells that say target player takes an extra turn. Don't mind if I do. The Ozolith and Felissa Fang of Silverquill are included to take further advantage of Voltron's weakness, which is the commander being incessantly targeted and destroyed. The Ozolith is able to store all those counters Yoshimaru had, not just the +1/+1 counters, but even the counter Kaya gives it, amongst others in the deck, when it dies. We can then just give it back to him from the Ozolith. That way we're banking all of our hard work in feeding our pupper. Felissa brings vengeance along with Yoshimaru's death by creating X tapped 2/1 flyers equal to the amount of counters on Yoshimaru. This helps us go wide instead of tall, thus potentially deterring anyone from getting rid of Yoshimaru just yet. However, since the deck also has other ways of putting +1/+1 counters on our other creatures, Felissa is also good for them, even if just incidentally. Doomweaver is another way to take advantage of Yoshimaru dying by drawing us a ton of cards. Not only is it an amazing blocker at 1/8 with reach for just 6 mana, when soul bonded to Yoshimaru, both its and Yoshimaru's death will have us draw into a ton of cards, which is amazing if we're able to recover Yoshimaru after he died. Thanks to these effects, Yoshimaru is just playing dead, which is a pretty common dog trick. However, your opponents probably won't be too entertained by it. Greven Predator Captain and Tevesh Sat, Doom of Fools, are the boogeymen when it comes to Yoshimaru decks. There are those who feel like no one should be sacrificing Yoshimaru to Tevesh Sat. But like I just said, Yoshimaru's just coming back to our hand afterwards. He's not really dying, he's just playing dead. While Tevesh only draws us 3 cards off of Yoshimaru, unlike Greven who can draw us cards equal to Yoshimaru's power at the cost of the same amount of life, his other abilities are still great. He can create 2 chump blockers, which is crucial for Voltron decks, but he can also steal everyone's commanders with his ultimate. Greven is also not just a sacrifice outlet. Sorry, Dog Trainer specialized in treating them to play dead, but quite the beater as well. He has built-in menace and gets as big as the amount of life we lost that turn. So if we did in fact use Yoshimaru with him when he was big enough, we will not only draw into a ton of cards, but potentially still end up smacking an opponent for a ton of life. Necropotence, Tome of Legends, and Jessica's Will are some pet-friendly ways the deck draws cards. Tome of Legends is great here since we not only have 2 commanders, with one of them costing only 1, but it also gets a lore counter each time one of our commanders attacks, which is quite often in a Voltron deck. Necropotence and Jessica's Will really have no need to explain, they're just too good to pass up. Speaking of interaction, even the deck's interaction and mana acceleration synergizes with Yoshimaru. Talia Heretic Cathar is not only an amazing stacks piece to slow down your opponents, but she also makes sure that your opponents don't get any new available blockers against Yoshimaru since their creatures enter the battlefield tapped. She also slows down multicolored decks by having their non-basic lands also enter the battlefield tapped. She's also a decent body once our creatures are getting pumped since she starts off as a 3/2 with first strike. Urza's Ruinous Blast, while flavorful, since it's also legendary, unfortunately won't trigger Yoshimaru. That being said, most of the permanents on our side of the board are bound to be legendary. This can be easily a one-sided board wipe. It won't exile commanders nor planeswalkers, but at least it'll hit most things that need exiling. In any case, Chaos Warp, Generous Gift, and Vindicate are included for good measure. The important thing about these 3 removal spells is that they can target lands. Maze of Ith effects exist, and the last thing we need is an opponent being able to reliably remove Yoshimaru from combat. Back to synergistic interaction, Lion Sash is included not only as a way to deal with graveyard decks, but to also potentially further pump Yoshimaru. Even if you're not facing graveyard decks, you can still exile instants, sorceries, fetch lands, etc. from graveyard. So it's still an amazing floor in the deck. Reconfigure is an amazing mechanic, and I hope to see more of it in the future. As previously mentioned, even the lands in the deck are legendary, which help to pump Yoshimaru. Yes, they bring the disadvantage of only tapping for 1 color in a 3-color deck, but testing proved that it's not so bad so long as you don't also include too many colorless legendary lands. A Ganjo Seat of the Empire, a Ganjo Castle, and Flagstones of Trocaire are obviously the most important ones because they tap for white. Hopefully they're not the only turn 1 mana source in your opening hand, because then they can't trigger Yoshimaru on turn 2, but any of them are, then it is what it is. They're not just here for the mana either, they're still pretty useful, with a Ganjo having a decent channel ability. Legion's Landing is another cheap way to trigger Yoshimaru if cast after him. It also creates a 1/1 token with lifelink when entering the battlefield. However, while that's a nice bonus, it can then transform into Adanto the First Fort, another legendary land that can tap for white. Fortunately, while the transformation won't trigger Yoshimaru, the enchantment entering will. We then have a mana sink to create a chump blocker or sacrifice fodder. So Kenzan, Crucible of Defiance, Shinka the Bloodsword Keep, and Hammerheim are the mono-red legendary lands of the deck. So Kenzan is another land that can create tokens, but it needs to be channeled to do so. Shinka can give Yoshimaru first strike for just 1 red and tapping, which is great, especially when he has Death Touch. Hammerheim might seem cute at first until you're facing off a Voltron deck of an opponent's and their commander has Landwalk. Then you'll be glad it had that bonus ability. Tomb of Urami, Takenuma, Abandoned Mire, Shizo Death's Storehouse, and Urborg are the mono-black legendary lands of the deck. Urborg isn't that niche considering that it can remove first strike from a potential blocker. It's not an everyday occurrence, but when it happens, you'll be glad it did have this bonus ability. Takenuma isn't really channeled that often since that ability is better suited for Reanimator decks, but if we really needed to recover a creature or planeswalker from our graveyard, we still can. Shizo is amazing because it can give Yoshimaru fear, potentially making it unblockable. Tomb of Urami pings us for 1 when tapped for mana, but that's okay. Its activated ability seems pretty detrimental since we have to pay 4, tap it, and then sacrifice all of our lands for a legendary 5/5 Flying Demon. While that can be a way to trigger Yoshimaru once more if you really needed that extra point of damage to win the game, it's still pretty harrowing. Unless you cast Primeval's Glorious Rebirth afterwards, but even then, this ability is ignored for the most part. I've probably used Urborg's activated ability more often than Tomb of Urami's. Speaking of Urborg Tomb of Yawgmoth is technically the deck's final land that can tap for black, but keep in mind that it has a colorless color identity. Urborg can help give an extra color to those mono-colored and few colorless lands in the deck, like Gemstone Caverns, the only colorless legendary land in the deck. However, it's still a great include. If you do have it in your opening hand and you're not the first player, you just got a free turn 0 land drop that can tap for any color mana, guaranteeing a turn 1 Yoshimaru plus a turn 1 land drop. If not, it can still trigger Yoshimaru when it enters the battlefield later on, and it still taps for mana while entering untapped. But better than that are Mox Amber and Mox Opal. Since they don't cost a land drop to play, we could just cast them for free, triggering Yoshimaru when they enter the battlefield. While Mox Opal requires 2 other artifacts to tap for mana, that's not that big of a disadvantage in this deck. Mox Amber has even fewer disadvantages since Yoshimaru will always have it tapped for at least white, but with so many legendary permanents in the deck, it will almost always tap for the color you need. Speaking of legendary permanents, Joris Familiar is even better than a Mana Rock since it reduces the cost of not just the legendary spells of the deck, but the non-legendary artifacts as well, so it reduces the cost of almost half of the deck. As for the Mana Rocks, Soul Ring, Talisman of Conviction, Talisman of Hierarchy, Talisman of Indulgence, Arcane Signet, Boros Signet, Orzhov Signet, and Rakdos Signet are the rest of them. Since the deck is non-green, their inclusion should be pretty apparent. That being said, if you prefer land-based ramp, you can partner Yoshimaru with any partner commander with green in its color identity. The rest of the decks is just the rest of the lands. The deck's running all 9 fetch lands, all 3 shock lands, Savai Triome, Mana Confluence, and Command Tower, as well as 2 basic plains, 2 basic mountains, and 1 basic swamp, since the majority of legendary lands tap for black, plus it's running Urborg Tomb of Yawgmoth. But since Blood Moon exists, we need at least one of each basic land in our commander decks to deal with non-basic land hate. As with all of my videos, you can edit your mana base as you see fit, but do try to include as many legendary mana sources as possible to really make the most out of Yoshimaru's trigger. The fetch lands do come in clutch though, since getting any of them turn 1 will guarantee you fetching for a land that can tap for white. That way you can cast Yoshimaru as early as possible. In fact, try to mulligan so that you can always cast Yoshimaru on turn 1. Alright, now for the changes to make this with Chrom instead. Obviously, Kraum Ludovic's Opus would replace Vial Smasher. While Vial Smasher can deal some non-combat damage to a random opponent, Kraum is another backup plan to the Voltron strategy, or a supplement to the Voltron strategy since you can swing Yoshimaru at one opponent and Kraum at the other. Being a 4/4 with flying and haste for just 5 mana is already amazing, but add to that the fact that it can also draw you cards is just icing on the cake. So pay attention to each time an opponent casts their second spell, since it can be very easy to miss that trigger. In any case, since Chrom is another Voltron commander in the command zone, all of the perks from previously mentioned cards that benefited Yoshimaru benefit Chrom as well for double the danger. As such, Tenza Godo's Maul is replacing Mask of Griselbrand. While the mask can draw you into a ton of cards if equipped to a beefy Yoshimaru that fainted, for lack of a more appropriate term, Tenza is actually a good substitute because it can be equipped to Chrom. Tenza gives Chrom +3/+3 and trample for just 1 to equip. So you can cast this after Yoshimaru to give it the +1/+1 counter, and then equip it to Chrom, or even Yoshimaru at a later turn. Joyra Weatherlight Captain is replacing Doomweaver. Doomweaver provides card advantage similarly to Mask of Griselbrand, but Joyra is going to have us draw into a ton of cards throughout a match. Not only will she trigger all of our non-legendary mana rocks and non-legendary equipment, but she's going to trigger off of every legendary spell we cast. It's a shame the legendary lands don't trigger her. Plus, this swap also adds another legendary permanent to the deck, which Yoshimaru appreciates. SR Wardwing Familiar replacing Falthus Shadowcat Familiar is a given. This one is pretty self-explanatory. While it doesn't make our commanders any more dangerous like Falthus does, it does give them slight protection via Pseudo Ward 3, which is still amazing, especially for Chrom, which isn't as easily recastable as Yoshimaru is. Felisa Fang of Silverquill and Obosh the Prey Piercer, while providing some great tech for Yoshimaru along with Vial Smasher, are replaced with Brago, King Eternal, and Urian Sky Nomad, 2 legendary creatures which are absolutely insane in a Yoshimaru deck. Whenever Brago deals combat damage to an opponent, we just have to blink all of our legendary permanents and mana rocks too, except for Yoshimaru. The amount of +1/+1 counters Yoshimaru gets is insane. Urian can do the same thing since you choose which permanents to delay blink. Combine both and you get twice as many triggers in the same turn. This is absolutely busted. Combine that with another swap in the deck, Necropotence for Aurelia the War Leader, and you really got something absurdly busted. Whenever she attacks for the first time each turn, we untap all of our creatures and get an extra combat step. Thanks to Brago, we can get infinite combat steps this way as well. When Brago and Aurelia attack, Aurelia triggers giving us an additional combat step. Then if Brago connects, he blinks Aurelia who has haste. Since it's a new instance of Aurelia, when she attacks in this new combat phase, we get another combat step after that for infinite combat steps. So good. Azor the Lawbringer is replacing Greven Predator Captain. While Greven can have us drawing cards by sacrificing Yoshimaru for the greater good, if that type of cruelty is too much for you, then Azor can draw us into a bunch of cards by just sinking your mana into him. We also gain life, which is a nice bonus too. As for the Planeswalkers, Jace Unraveler of Secrets and Venser the Sojourner replace Tevesh Sa and Kaya. While they all have their uses, Jace can draw us a card after we scry one first. He can also bounce a creature to its owner's hand, which can be a possible blocker, or one of our own creatures to recast like possibly Urian. His ultimate is super oppressive, so there's that as well. Venser delay blinks any permanent we own, which is great for getting that extra Yoshimaru trigger, or for resetting any Planeswalker. His -1 is super busted considering we have 2 Voltron commanders as well as attackers that trigger on combat damage or attack. Sending in Yoshimaru and or Chrom unblocked when we're controlling Kedis is quite busted. His emblem is also quite oppressive and super busted when it comes to interaction and removal. As for the rest of the swaps, they're pretty self-explanatory. In this table you can see all of the black legendary lands being swapped out for blue legendary lands. Urborg Tomb of Yawgmoth is swapped out for City of Brass since there's no sense in keeping it in there. The same goes for the rest of the mana base in terms of shock lands, the Triome, basic lands, talisman, and signets. As always, you can edit the mana base as you see fit, but do try to maximize Yoshimaru's triggers by including legendary lands and legendary mana rocks. This episode presents just some ideas on how to build around Yoshimaru. As I mentioned in the beginning, there's 56 other legends with partner that you can use with Yoshimaru, since he is the main commander of this partner pairing and this video in particular. You could even partner him with Miaria, Thorn of the Glade if you want to be able to have Lurrus as your companion, or swap out all of the even costed cards in the Vial Smasher build for odd costed ones to use Obosh as your companion. The configurations are staggering, so there's quite a lot of ways to build Yoshimaru to say the least. As for me, while I enjoyed both of these lists, I actually liked the Yoshimaru Chrom pairing a bit more than Yoshimaru Vial Smasher. If you're interested in the deck lists of these spicy brews of mine, you can find a link to them down in the description. I would like to thank all my patrons for supporting me, and a quick shout out to all my higher tier patrons, the brewers, for their patronage. I'd also like to thank anyone using my TCG Player affiliate link. That also helps out the channel. And to everyone, thanks for watching this season finale of The Brewery on the Commander Tavern. I am the Meta Kirby, happy brewing, and see you next time.